All right, false argument number 4, and this is actually my favorite. I have had several opinionated developers making bold and strong opinions that my repositories are coupled to Entity Framework. When I hear a comment like that, I know that that person doesn't know what an interface is. In fact, there are lots of developers out there who use interfaces on a daily basis, but they don't really know the concept behind interfaces. And it's not their fault, it's because no one has taught them interfaces properly. In my C Sharp Intermediate course, I have an entire section on interfaces, and there I explain them for you in a very hands on and pragmatic way. None of the textbooks that I have read or the university courses been able to explain interfaces, at least to me personally, because most of these textbooks are so theoretical, and a lot of university lecturers don't have hands on experience in the industry, and that's very unfortunate. In fact, a lot of lecturers are PhD students lecturing just to make a living. And when I was at the university for 8 years, I was very frustrated. I didn't want to sit in a class, waste my time listening to these boring explanations. It was obvious to me personally that my lecturer had no clue about interfaces. Now, chances are you may be able to relate to me on this story. So, here's what I want you to take away: an interface is a contract, it's not an implementation. Look at our controller here. Here we're referencing iVehicle repository. So we say this controller or this class is dependent upon iVehicle repository. Or in other words, we say this class is tightly coupled to iVehicle repository. Okay? Now let's take a look at the declaration of this interface. What do we have here? We have three method declarations. So our controller is tightly coupled to these method declarations. In more precise terms, our controller is coupled to the signature of these methods. Signature of a method includes the method's name and its parameters, their type, their order. So if I change the signature of a method here, meaning if I change its name or its parameters, I have broken this interface, I've broken this contract. So this interface needs to be recompiled. And because our controller is dependent upon this interface, that controller class should also be recompiled. And of course, the assemblies in which these constructs are defined, those assemblies need to be redeployed. Now, here's a question for you. In this interface, do you see anything about Entity Framework? Look at this getVehicle method, for example. It has two parameters, an integer and a boolean, and these are standard .NET types. So there is no Entity Framework here. There is no DB context. There is no DB set. Look at the return type. It's returning a task of vehicle. Vehicle is part of our applications domain. It's part of our domain model. So there is no sign of Entity Framework here. Now let's take a look at the implementation of this interface. Vehicle repository. Look, here we have a reference to DB context. So of course this repository is coupled to Entity Framework. It must be coupled to Entity Framework. Otherwise, how are we going to use Entity Framework to get or persist data? There is no such a thing as zero coupling in software. There is always a level of coupling. Otherwise, how are we going to use third-party libraries and frameworks? There's always coupling. But what matters here is that nowhere in our controllers we are using this vehicle repository implementation. In our controller, we are using the repository interface, not its implementation. Now look at our vehicle class. This is part of our domain model. Nowhere here you're referencing DB context or DB set. This is just a plain old CLR object or POCO. So nowhere in my application I'm using that vehicle repository implementation. The only exception is in the startup class where we configure services for dependency injection. And of course, here we need to wire up our interfaces to their implementation. So this is the only place I'm referencing this implementation. Now back in our vehicle class, if we had a method here that would take a DB context or a DB set as a parameter, we would say this class is tightly coupled to Entity Framework, and that's bad. We don't want to do that. So once again, in our application, we are programming against repository interfaces, not the implementations.